today's world. And there are two pieces I want to talk about here. The first is this tug of war between state and private corporation, right? You've spoken at length about it, both from a philosophical standpoint, economic standpoint, political governance standpoints, right? You talk about, I think at some point you say that it's very interesting to not just draw analogies with that time, but really look at the genealogy, I think, which is the point you're also starting to make now. But so I want to ask you, you mentioned Adam Smith, you mentioned Hobbes, and all of these guys at the time, as they're looking at this tug of war between what is considered the state at the time, the crown, and these private corporations, which often again are not necessarily all private, as you rightly said, sometimes have more of a dual nature. What is, in your view, if you were to step back and say, how has this relationship between the private sector corporations and state, right? State either being a nation state as it exists today, or the empire as it existed then. How has that relationship evolved according to you, right? If you were to draw out a big picture for us, has much changed? Is that tug of war, what I call the tug of war, just going on and not much has changed? Or has it really evolved?
I think in the big picture, I'm going to stay on your side and say it's a tug of war that, or a kind of ebb and flow. I like the maritime metaphor even more, right? Given, I guess, what I'm looking at.
More appropriate.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm coming from more land-based.
Exactly,
context.
right.
That's right.
Right. This is the constant tension in the history of empires for millennia, land or sea. The big picture, certainly over the course of what I look at in the book, and I think it transfers into what happens after the book, which is the modern world, is that you have a kind of moment in time where it looks as if the state power or that tug of war is on what, or that ebbing and flowing is going in one direction. After World War II, it seemed as if you had a lot of people writing as if this was the final stage of history, right? That states had won. You see international organizations emerge like the United Nations, where nation states are the only bodies with membership in a certain sense. Sure. If you look really closely, but like
that matter,
right? But then, and you saw an emergence of a kind of state-based organization to politics. But then by the time you look in the late 20th century, the early 21st century, and I'm stepping on your territory here. I'm not as much of an expert, but I do think about these things as part of why I wrote the book. You start to see, the emergence of or at least us being able to see a different kind of organization of international, of non-state forms of power, challenging, making the state reimagine how it organizes that. But that doesn't make the state go away. Then you see a kind of response to that in various policies about trying to reinscribe the abilities of states to, say, control their borders or to regulate those companies, or to do something, to try to figure out where those companies, who it is that sort of interacts and critiques those companies. It's so I think that there's no linear story here where one emerges. You watch a movie, right? It's set in the 25th century, and it turns out the corporations have taken over the world, and there's no more states, or vice versa. That it's all the states and the corporations are. I think that's a science fiction. I think what you really are seeing is this constant relationship between the two, and to think of them as both coherent. Like I said before, I mean, states are made up of lots of moving parts as well as companies, right? Agencies, people working inside of them, competition within itself as well as amongst one another, federal structures, these kinds of systems, all of which, federal structures, for example, also one could trace back to some form of corporate theory as well. So so I think my answer to your question, even though maybe it's a hedge of some sort, is to say that I do think that what you learn from looking at the history and looking today is not to get a prediction of a winner or a loser in the future, or how things are going to go. It's to allow you to see much more clearly what's going on in the present and the future, without bringing to the assumptions that say states do politics and companies do economics, and if you start from that premise, you don't really see actually what's happening, right?
Yeah, and of course, I think one of the key learnings I've had from studying the colonial corporations of the time and their relationship with the with the crown or the state of that time. Two things, right? One is that you can think of it from a functional standpoint. Like they start off from one function, these corporations, let's say trade to begin with, or finding new lands or new markets. But then slowly, as the stakes get higher, the geopolitics of it starts to become very, not dominant, but a lot more important. And that's where you see the East India Company, for example, going from a trading focused corporation into a governing and military and trading corporation, right? Whereas you mentioned the fact that they start taxing when they get the Diwani, right? Rights in Mughal India, that's when their functions now have expanded, right? And I see that as a functional sort of spectrum that these corporations move on. Fast forward to today, you can see the parallels. Many of the tech companies of today might start with one function that they are focused on. For example, we can take a couple of names. Microsoft starts off as a software company that's building just desktop software. But today also happens to have one of the biggest cybersecurity teams in the world, right? And so the functional expansion of, I think, these corporations is an interesting parallel I see between, the period you've covered in your book and today. And the other piece is, I think the other learning that I see in that tug of war from earlier and today is the kind of institutional ways in which the state will often respond to regulate the tech firms of today or the trading firms of the era you talk about, right? You've spoken about how, at length, about how the almost tense relationship, even though it's often, they're often in bed with each other, also the members of parliament in England with the East India Company often as shareholders. But there's also a tense relationship between the philosophers of the time, the political theorists of the time, the economists of the time, and many of the other intellectual leaders of the time.